I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 17-3, the anti-war movement. As the Vietnam War continued on through the late 60s into the 1970s, obviously the discontent amongst those living in our country became greater and greater. As we're going to see today, the protest movement is really going to take hold, especially on college campuses across the country. And we'll see is really the objective. We'll see deep divisions within American society over the American involvement in the Vietnam War. We'll look at the actions taking place in Vietnam, including the Tet Offensive and American reaction to that. And we'll summarize the factors that impacted the outcome of the 1968 presidential election. So let's look at the fundamental root cause here with number one. Why did the war in Vietnam divide Americans? First, the televised nature of the war is the first war that was basically brought into the homes of the American citizen at this point in time in the 1960s. Most Americans had a TV at this point. Also broadcasts of embedded reporters who are actually over in Vietnam reporting back to the home front. So as casualty numbers increased, support for the war decreased. So basically it's a correlation there. As you saw the numbers go up in terms of the people losing their lives, people began to question as to whether or not this war was worth fighting. And thirdly, for number one, many Americans believed soldiers were dying in a war that had very little to do with American interest. It's a country halfway around the world in Southeast Asia, a jungle-based country, one in which we didn't necessarily have any real relationship with, and we're wondering why in the world are we even here. Two, how did the dynamic of soldiers serving the war change by 1965? The war was shifting from volunteer army to ones being deployed who were drafted or forced to fight in larger and larger numbers in 1965. So once again, we're seeing a shift. The shift being from those who wanted to be there, wanted to be a member of the military, to those who were being forced to be a member of the military. Three, how many men were drafted to fight in the Vietnam War? Well, the Selective Service Act of 1948 allowed for 1.5 million men to be drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. The act required all men age 18 to register with the Selective Service Department. Today's young men still need to register, but there is not currently a military draft. So, for example, let's say you're 17 and somewhere in the next year you should be registering with the Selective Service Department. Therefore, if there was a serious war ongoing, they would maybe reinstate the draft, and you would already be issued your Selective Service draft number, and it would kind of expedite the process rather than starting from scratch. So everybody has to kind of be part of what is a broader database of potential draftees in the event that they do at some point in time need to reinstate the draft. A lot of these protocols were developed over the course of time, learning from what worked well and what didn't work well in previous wars, like World War I or World War II. Okay, let's look at number 4. Why were people from poor backgrounds disproportionately represented in the U.S. troops in Vietnam? Well, anybody who could, for the most part, avoid the draft would do so, and the more means you had, the wealthier you were, the more likely it would be that you could dodge the draft. Another way you could dodge the draft was initially college students. If you entered college, they would exempt you or kind of give you what would be known as a deferment for military service. People in certain jobs were able to defer their military service as well if they were called to fight in Vietnam. And the way in which they would kind of determine whether or not you would be drafted, they would have local draft boards. They would have an impact in making decisions on who might receive a deferment or those who would be forced to serve. The poorer you were, the more likely it would be that you would not be able to kind of figure a loophole out, or you would maybe not be able to afford college. And this was disproportionately African Americans during this period of time. So at a rate of an average soldier, African Americans were 2 times more likely to be in the military and fighting in Vietnam than their white counterparts. 5, how did the Civil Rights Movement interact with the anti-war movement? So when you think about the anti-war movement and the Civil Rights Movement, obviously in both cases we're seeing, especially what I just mentioned previously, the idea African Americans were being disproportionately forced to serve. This would really, and obviously die in the war, this would kind of spark a civil rights outrage in African Americans. Made up, here's a statistic for you, 10% of the American population in the 1960s, but they were accounting for 20% of war deaths. Civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out against the war by pointing out the unfairness of integrating troops, but not schools. 6, how was the selective service draft system amended in 1969? It was changed to a strict lottery system in hopes of eliminating some of the unfairness in the draft process. Seven, why were so many of the anti-war protesters from the middle class? Well, many of your young middle class citizens were in college, and when they would go to college, they'd become a little bit better educated about the geographical nature of Vietnam, the rationale for why we're there, and the reason why we continue to fight there, even though it was kind of a losing kind of campaign. Colleges kind of became the center for the anti-war movement. Students who were thought to think critically, and those were the students who were questioning the motives for the war. There were a lot of intellectual anti-war professors at some of these universities too, who helped to motivate students and kind of instill kind of that desire to stand up. Additionally, college students had the time and resources to organize anti-war protests. The average college student, even in today's society, goes to school 15 hours a week of required class time, and the rest of the week is kind of up to you to study, complete assignments, and things like that. So there is a lot of flexibility within the framework of a typical college student schedule. 8, who are the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS? What did they do? They were originally founded in 1960 to fight against racism and poverty. They took up the anti-war movement. They staged what is called teach-ins, starting in the middle 1960s. In 1964, the University of Michigan campus. Teach-ins quickly spread to other college campuses across the country. Okay, number 9. What did the 26th Amendment to the Constitution establish? This gave the right to vote to all citizens aged 18 or older. Previous to this, it was 21 to vote. People argued that if you're old enough to go off to fight and die in a war for the country, then of course you should have the right to vote to kind of express your views on a particular situation. 10, how did media coverage of the Vietnam War impact people's perception of the war? TV allowed all Americans to see the brutality of the Vietnam War. The media showed deaths, injuries, chaos, the messy conflict itself. And the more you saw on TV, the less likely it seemed the United States was going to come out of this war victorious. Many Americans, as they watched the war, began to make this similar conclusion. What is the point of this war? This war seems to be pointless. Why are we continuing to fight this? It also led to the establishment of what became known as the credibility gap. If you look at 11, a credibility gap means that the actual stories that the media and the government were telling you were different. So the government was telling you one thing, the war is going well, the victory is in sight, the victory is near. On the other hand, the media is showing you the actual pictures, photos, video clips, and the actual testimony of reporters from the front lines, and you're obviously seeing quite a different picture. So the credibility gap during the Vietnam War was the contradiction between media reports showing the war was unfolding without success and the government announcements describing successes and promising that victory was near. As the old saying goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And there's a little cartoon imagery there for you. And so that's a military leader, and a lot of the military leaders are speaking out about how well the war was going. You have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Sometimes General Westmoreland will be interviewed and giving, let's say, what amount to be a press conference. And you can see whitewash is kind of a term that means that you're covering up the truth. And you can see this general here and a lot of stars on his shoulder, which could indicate General Westmoreland. I'm not 100% certain that's who's portrayed in the cartoon. But covering up the truth about the Vietnam War, kind of whitewashing the truth. 12, who was General William Westmoreland? He was the general in charge of the American forces in Vietnam. He was brought home to address mounting concerns over the Vietnam War. And Westmoreland reassured the public that the enemy was on the brink of defeat. That cartoon would make a lot of sense to attribute to Westmoreland. What was the Tet Offensive? It was a North Vietnamese attack on the 36 provincial capitals, 5 other major cities, and U.S. Embassy at Saigon in January 1968. It was later nicknamed the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. It was named after the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. So this was the offensive of the Communist North Vietnamese. Why was the U.S. surprised by the Tet Offensive? Well, the U.S. military knew the Viet Cong would attack, but they did not realize the Viet Cong were capable of such a large, coordinated, and damaging attack. The timing of the attack was also a surprise since the United States expected a ceasefire during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. Eventually, the United States and the North Vietnamese forces repelled the attack, but not until after suffering major damage. Many consider the Tet Offensive to be offensive literally, in the sense that it was an important turning point, damaging American confidence, turned many Americans against the war, to change the American policy in Vietnam. Before Tet, American leaders believed the communists were nearly defeated. The Tet forced the United States to reevaluate the strength and determination of the communists and to change its strategy to one that sought a negotiation instead of victory. So basically, the general meaning of the Tet Offensive and the impact was that we had a war that we thought was certainly going to be in our favor in the end, and eventually we would win. But now the North Vietnamese proved to be difficult enough of a challenge that winning the war was less than certain. 16, what recommendation did Lyndon Johnson, Secretary of Defense Clarke Clifford, make to him after the Tet Offensive? He concluded the war could not be won. He told Johnson that he should look for a means of negotiating for peace rather than an escalation of the war. What events contributed to Lyndon Johnson's decision not to seek re-election in 1968, which kind of shocked the United States and the world? People sensed that Johnson was weakening. Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy had already emerged as potential strong candidates to challenge him for the Democratic nomination. As the disapproval of the Vietnam War increased, the approval of Johnson's job as president declined. LBJ was heavily favored to win the March 1968 New Hampshire primary. And remember, in order to be the nominee for your political party, you have to go through 50 primaries or caucuses across the country in each of the 50 states. But his narrow victory over Eugene McCarthy in the first in the nation primary in New Hampshire indicated that his candidacy was in trouble. So on March 31st, 1968, LBJ announced that he would not seek nor would he accept the Democratic nomination to be the nominee of the Democratic Party. And you can see the newspaper headlines. You can see the image there from the announcement that he made. So Robert F. Kennedy quickly emerged as the favorite to be the Democratic nominee. He was a beloved figure. The Kennedy name was still very, very popular, remains popular in American history. So when you think about the primaries, California being one of the largest in the nation and most important of the primaries, after Robert F. Kennedy won the Democratic primary in California on June 5th, 1968, he was the presumptive, presumed. They were assuming he was going to be the Democratic nominee and likely the next president of the United States of America. But the Kennedy curse and the tragedy that's surrounded the Kennedy family throughout its history in the 20th century continued as Robert F. Kennedy was giving a victory speech on the left. A few seconds later, he had stepped off the podium and was gunned down, and you could see him slumped over and at that point in time deceased on the ground there at a hotel in California. And he was assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan. So what this led to was complete chaos at the Democratic nominating convention in Chicago in 1968. So when you look at the imagery below, you can see the protests gathering in Chicago. The Democratic Party was divided, and those tensions came to a head as the party established a presidential platform. At the time of the convention, no candidate had enough delegates to get the nomination based on voting, just because the candidates were not in there long enough, and Kennedy was dead and Johnson was out. So they were divided over many different issues, including Vietnam, civil rights, poverty, national debt. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in 1968 as well. You couple that with Robert F. Kennedy, so there's a lot of high emotions in the Democratic Party. Ultimately, Triple H Hubert H. Humphrey was chosen as Democratic presidential candidate over the anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy. Violence between police and protesters broke out on the streets. And because LBJ had dropped out and Kennedy was killed, no Democratic candidate had the requisite number of primary votes to actually be the nominee, which led to a lot of the fighting on the floor of the Democratic National Convention and also out in the streets of Chicago. The Republican nominee against Hubert Humphrey would be Richard Nixon. Nixon appealed to what he called the silent majority. This is the portion of the American population that were not protesting the war. He also used the Southern strategy to pry conservative Southern voters away from traditional support for Democrats. He also tried to appeal to those who were disappointed by all the violence coming out of the Democratic National Headquarters Convention. And then ultimately, Nixon would win a very narrow victory here. Let's see if I can enlarge this a little bit here. Here's the election results. All right, so you should know the Republican candidates. The presidential was Richard Nixon. Spiro Agnew was the vice presidential running mate against Hubert Humphrey and Ed Muskie. There was also a third-party candidate, George Wallace and Curtis LeMay, and they were kind of the segregationists or the American Independent Party, and they actually won several of the southern states here, all in the green. You can see the ultimate results. Nixon at 31,000,000.7, Humphrey at 31.2, so a razor close election of around 43% and almost 43% here for Humphrey. The electoral votes were a little bit more of a wide open victory for Nixon, 301 to 191, with the 46 going to the Wallace candidacy. So although Nixon won the election, very similar to what had happened to him in 1960, Nixon lost the 1960 election against John F. Kennedy by 100,000 votes, and he won the election against Hubert Humphrey by 500,000 votes. So very narrow victory, very narrow loss in the two presidential elections for Nixon. And then when you look at the 1960s, as we reflect back, why was the 60s considered one of the most tumultuous decades in American history? Well, obviously the Cold War, we had subsequently the space race and arms race, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Civil Rights Movement, many assassinations in the 60s, the Vietnam War, and of course the counterculture movement that reacted against the war. Hopefully you enjoyed our ongoing discussions here on the Vietnam War. Until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.